Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we delve further into the wisdom of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like and share this audiobook, helping us expand its reach and granting more individuals access to its profound insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner peace. Your participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible is truly invaluable. Let's begin today's reading. Centered. January 24, 2017. The Pali word samadhi is usually translated as concentration. I know at least one teacher, though, who objects to that translation on the grounds that we associate the idea of being concentrated on something with being tense. The spot where we're staying concentrated is a concentrated spot of tension. As he points out, that's not the quality we're trying to develop at all. There are other ways, though, of thinking of concentration. That you're not focused on a spot outside of your center of who you think you are. The center's supposed to be right inside where you think you are, like a lens whose focal point is zero, inside the lens itself. It's a different kind of concentration. Just think of it as being centered. And the quality that the Buddha recommends is eventually one where your awareness fills the whole body, and every part of the body has almost equal importance. It's like the concentration you use when you're playing a video game, and the enemy could appear at any point on the screen. Your awareness has to be spread out to the whole screen, giving equal importance to every pixel, so that as soon as the enemy appears, no matter where, you can detect him and zap him in time. Another comparison is the way trackers go through the forest. They're looking for signs of animals who have been there. And they can't focus only on the ground. They have to focus also on the leaves of the trees, the branches that might be broken. The signs of animals having passed by can be anywhere, so the trackers need what they call scattershot concentration. In other words, your concentration is spread out in all directions, while your awareness is centered inside, so that no one spot in your outside range of vision is getting more attention than others. Everything is equal. You're ready to pick up the signs wherever they are. One way of developing this kind of concentration is to think of your awareness starting with your hands and your feet, and then moving inward. Relax your hands. Relax the wrists. Go up the arms, the shoulders. Then start with your feet and come up from the bottom, through the legs, the pelvis, up the back. Bring your awareness into the area around the heart or into the area right where your field of vision seems to be centered. See if you can maintain a sense of being centered there, but at the same time maintaining the full range of where you've been all connected together. That's the kind of concentration the Buddha's talking about, where you're one with the object, which in this case is the whole body. It's not like you're sitting in one spot of the body watching the breath in another spot of the body. You're sitting in the middle of the breath, and the breath is bathing you on all sides. And think of it, as it comes in, as being totally unobstructed. It can come in, go out, with a sense of ease. You're centered, but there's a sense of ease. You're not using tension to hold yourself there. There's a little bit of tension, but not much. Because, after all, we're trying to create a state of mind that we can maintain for long periods of time. If there's a lot of tension in maintaining it, it's not going to last. Your strength will wear out. You'll start getting tired of it. And instead of being nourishing and refreshing, the concentration will become tiresome. But if you can think of all the scattered tentacles of your awareness coming back into the center and leaving everything on the periphery very relaxed, it creates a kind of stability that's easy to maintain. It may not be easy to get used to this in the beginning, especially if you're the kind of person who likes to be focused just on one point. But this type of concentration is longer lasting, once you master it. So it's a talent worth developing. It changes your relationship to how you relate to the body, how you relate to events in the mind, because this broader concentration is very hard to knock over. If your concentration is one-pointed, It's very easy to lose, because once you move the point, the concentration slipped. But with this, you've got a larger frame of reference. Things can come and go in the midst of that frame of reference, and you can see them, but they don't shake the frame. The frame is still there. Like that image I sometimes use of being a screen on a window. Sounds go through the screen. Wind goes through the screen. But the screen doesn't get moved, and it doesn't obstruct the sounds and the wind from moving through. It's open. Open to things outside, but at the same time unaffected by them. The same observation can apply to your thoughts. Thoughts can come floating through the mind, but you don't latch onto them. You don't get interested in them. You're centered right here. You know they're there, but you don't really pay attention to them. Your center stays maintained right here. All your awareness gravitates to the center. That's the quality of concentration we're looking for. Because only in that kind of concentration can you spread the sense of ease, well-being, and rapture through the body. You've opened up all the channels as you've moved into the center. That gives a feeling of being connected to the breath energy fields, that everything is in harmony throughout the body. This is an ideal state of mind for observing what's going on in the mind. Thoughts can arise and pass away. You see them arising and passing away, but you're not shaken by them. And you're not arising and passing away along with them. They have their ups and downs, but you stay still, here in the middle. And so the processes of thoughts, as they arise and pass away, become a lot clearer. You can see the machinations of the mind as it creates a thought. And as in the video game, you can zap the thoughts whenever and wherever they appear. Because it's not that thoughts don't have a place in the body. For a thought to stay and to be the kind of thought that you can hold in mind for a while, there has to be a pattern of tension someplace in the body associated with it. That's the marker that keeps it there. Without that marker, thoughts can't stay. To hold them in mind, you have to hold them in the body, too. It's because of those little markers of tension that any work involving a lot of thinking and planning is really tiresome. You can sit at your desk and not really do any physical activity, but you come away very tired because of all the tension that's been playing around in the body. But when you get the mind centered like this, you can see the little pattern of tension as it comes together with the thought, and you can zap the pattern of tension, and the thought will dissolve. The more quickly you can do that, the more you see the early stages of how the mind constructs a thought, and you're less likely to be taken in by those processes. You can stop them when you see that they're arbitrary and are not going anywhere useful. If it turns out that the thought is something you need to think about, okay, you can think about it, but you can exert more control over where it's going, because you're staying with this larger framework of the entire body. You're not getting into the framework of the thought. And if you lose the center, well, go back to the periphery again. Start with the hands, start with the feet, and move back into the center again. Or think of yourself backing into the body, if that's a helpful perception, anything to give the sense that you're here. Sitting surrounded by the breath, by the body. And your center is firm. Not firm through tension, firm simply through the fact that it's right in the middle, where everything gravitates on its own. That's the kind of center you can maintain for long periods of time. Tapping into the breath. July 17, 2017. Time and again, I say when you're focusing on the breath to remember that the breath is not so much the air coming in and out of the lungs, as it is a flow of energy in the body. One of those flows is the flow that allows the air to come in and out. The question is, where does that flow come from? It doesn't come in with the in-breath. It actually comes from within the body itself. So if you're having trouble breathing comfortably, you might ask yourself, where does the breath actually start in the body? Ajahn Lee lists what he calls the resting spots of the breath, such as the tip of the sternum or a spot just above the navel. And you can try any one of those. In fact, you'll find that there's no one spot where the breath starts. It starts from many, but you can focus on one and make the most of it. Say, for instance, that you're going to focus at the tip of the breastbone. You have to relax around that spot in order to allow the breath to spread from there in a way that actually feels good for the body. Because when we have different patterns of tension in the body, we tend to breathe with those patterns of tension, and we just make things worse. You have to remind yourself that there is a healthy breath in there. And you're going to allow it to move through the body by relaxing around it and noticing what feels good at that spot in the body. If you feel like you're breathing in too much or breathing out too much, be very sensitive and very on top of this. And you'll find that the breath really does become soothing. This is especially useful when you have a disease of one kind or another. You can use the soothing breath to work through a lot of the tension that may build up around the pain or the organ that's malfunctioning. In the cases where there's unpleasant energy in some spot of the body, you may want to move to another spot first. Focus your attention there. And then, when you feel more confident, you can go to the spot that's actually malfunctioning and ask yourself, where is the healthy breath in here? Notice the attitude, not so much that you're going to make it healthy. You're just going to allow it. It's in this way that you learn how to use your perceptions and how to change your perceptions so that they actually are conducive to settling down. As you work with the breath in this way, you'll find that there are lots of different levels. It's like the water table at Wadasakaram. They dug their wells in a very unlikely spot. Here they were at the edge of the ocean, a mangrove swamp, part of the tidal flats. And they would dig a well to use the water there. It didn't seem promising, but they found that there were different levels. You would dig down to a certain level, and the water would be brackish. You dig down to another level and it would be fresh. And then another level, and then it would be brackish again. It was like a layer cake, and the trick to digging the well was getting it just the right depth to tap into a layer that was good. In the same way, your body has lots of layers, lots of different energies moving around. Try to dig your well down to a spot where the energy is good. And then give it space to maximize it. In Thai they have a phrase, not being able to breathe with your full stomach, which means that there's tension or tightness in the abdomen, and you don't feel like you're getting your full refreshment from the breath. Again, it's not so much the air going down into the abdomen. It's the question of whether the energy is allowed to move or propagate freely through the area of the abdomen, so that every part feels nourished by that movement of energy. Now, your problem may not be in the abdomen, but you know where your difficult spots are in the body. So you can play with them. Remind yourself that there may be a layer in there that's actually healthy. Try to find it. It's the same as when you've got problems with rapture. When rapture comes on, some people like it, some people don't. If you're one of the ones who don't, learn how to change your perception so you don't feel threatened by it. Some people feel threatened by it because they've had experiences with almost drowning, and it's a similar sensation. A feeling of intense fullness throughout the body. You have to remind yourself that you're surrounded by air. There's no problem. But even then, as you move the rapture through the body, it's good up to a point. There comes a point where you have to go beyond it. Here again, think of layers. Find a layer of energy that's not quite so active, that's calmer, with a sense of ease, and focus there. The movements of rapture can be in another layer for a while. As you're not focusing on them, after a while they begin to dissipate. So think of the body as having many layers. And you're going to try to tune into the layer that's right for what you need right now. Some layers are more energizing. Some are more calming. But it's up to you to make your survey and to figure out how to relate to these energies. Here in English, we don't have a really good vocabulary for these energies. And even in Thai where they talk about them, and people tend to have a more intuitive sense of what we're talking about when we say breath energy, the vocabulary is not that large. Ajahn Lee talks about breath energies that spin around in place, breath energies that move back and forth, the visiting breath, he calls it, which is the in and out breath. And then there's the still breath, a breath that doesn't move at all. That's in a layer there, too. He says the middling layers are the ones where we're working with the energies in the blood vessels and nerves, as we spread them through the different parts of the body. And they stay there in the body. They don't go in and out. They help the in and out breath, but they themselves don't go in and out. Those are the ones that you want to work with because they're a good testing ground, both for getting a sense of well-being that really goes deep, deep, deep inside, and for teaching you the power of perception. That the labels you apply to the body really do have an influence on how you're going to be experiencing the body, how you're going to be able to settle down in the body. The still breath, if you can get your well down to the still breath and tap into it, is a place to rest. So use that when you need to rest. But remind yourself that the meditation is not all about resting. It's about learning what's going on between body and mind, because this is a good testing ground for all the issues in the mind. The body is the first thing you're aware of. The body is the first thing you're moving around, the area of reality you're most responsible for. And yet it's not self. That doesn't mean you have no control over it. It just means that there are limits to what you can control. So you want to explore the limits and make the most of what's inside them. Years back, I knew someone who was going to study in Thailand, and she'd been practicing Ajahn Lee's method. She was staying with an Ajahn who didn't have any background in Ajahn Lee's method, and he told her, "Why are you adjusting the breath? It's just a fabrication." She told me that, and my response, although I didn't say it to him, was, "Well, why are you washing your body? Why do you clean your body? It's just a fabrication. You have to take care of these things because they'll then take care of you. And in taking care of them skillfully, you learn an awful lot about the body and the mind. All the 5 aggregates. And if you want to know what's not self, what's beyond your control, you try to exert as much control as you can in this area. You'll find there will be limits. It's when you want to run into the limits that you say, "Oh, this is really not self." But you don't give up beforehand. If you give up beforehand, you're letting go, as Ajahn Lee says, like a pauper, someone who doesn't have anything to show for letting go at all, because there was nothing there to begin with. But if you make the most of these potentials you have in the body, the potentials you have in the mind, then when you let them go, they're still there. They're of use to you, and they're of use to other people. It's like working hard and getting a good car. You don't take it to bed with you. You leave it outside. You use it when you need to. And you let other people use it, too. In other words, you let go of something, but there's still a lot of use to be gotten out of it, as opposed to not having the car to begin with. So explore the potentials you have here in the body for dealing with energy. And once you've found the areas where the breath rests and the breath comes from, protect those. Don't let them get exhausted. Don't let them get depleted. Have a sense of their being full, even during the out-breath. Then they can fill the rest of the body with good energy that allows you to settle down with a sense of just right. Well balanced, with the pleasure and rapture the Buddha describes as permeating the entire body, because you've tapped into the right level. What is one? July 13, 2017. In the canon, there's a brief catechism called the Novices' Questions. It's a list of basic Buddhist concepts, lined up from 1 to 10. The questions are: what is 1? What is 2? All the way up to what is 10? And the most interesting one of the lot is: what is 1? And the answer is: all beings subsist on food. As long as you're a being, you're going to need food. Of course, when the Buddha is talking about food here, it's not just physical food. There's also the food for consciousness, which in some cases he divides up as physical food, contact, intentions, and consciousness itself. In other places, he identifies the food for consciousness with the other aggregates: form, feeling, perception, and fabrications. It's only arahants who don't need to feed on these kinds of food. They feed physically, but their minds no longer need to feed because they don't identify themselves as beings. To be a being, you have to be clinging to something, attached to something. But arahants have no attachments, no clinging, so they're not even defined as beings. When they pass away, you can't even define them as existing, non-existing, both, or neither. But as for us, we're still feeding because we're still beings. We're beings on the way to awakening. The Buddha himself, before his awakening, was called a bodhisattva, a being on the way to awakening. So while we're on the path, we need food. And concentration is the prime food we use. Otherwise, if we don't have this food, we're going to go off nibbling on all kinds of other things. All the different members in the committee of your mind have their ideas about what would be good dinner tonight, what the food should be, how it should be fixed. And a lot of the discussion in your mind is about how you're going to feed. So when you learn how to meditate and get the mind into a state of well-being, finding an object you like, learning how to maximize the sense of pleasure through your directed thought and evaluation, you're adding a new item to the menu. And you want to learn how to develop a taste for this. That means, for instance, when you're working with the breath, trying to breathe in a way that feels really, really satisfying. It's not just in, out. Ask yourself, where are the most sensitive parts in the body right now? Can you breathe for their sake? And what kind of breathing would feel good for them? You may have a personal preference for longer breathing, but that particular part in your body might like shorter breathing. So pay attention to what it needs. And then, when you satisfy that part of the body, look for other parts of the body that are especially sensitive, and see if you can satisfy them, too. The more you can hit your sensitivities like this, the more satisfying the food of concentration will be. Then you can use it to deal with other issues as they come up, the other proposals for what you want to feed on right now. If there are sensual desires coming up in the mind, one of the first ways of dealing with them is to notice, when the desire comes, where do you feel the tension in the body? Often there's a tension in the back of the hands. Well, breathe in a way that feels really good in the back of the hands. Any place where there's tension developing. That way, as part of your negotiations with the members of the committee, you say, see, here's a better food. It's right here, no trouble at all. Whereas the food of sensual desire can cause a lot of trouble. It's the same with anger. If you're quick to get angry about things, you have to be quick in learning how to feed the mind and feed the body with the sense of well-being that comes from concentration. Otherwise, you start feeding on the anger and it ends up harming you, harming other people. It's like the kind of food that may be good as you eat it, but it's going to cause trouble further down in your digestive tract. Sleepiness, torpor. That's another kind of food, one that we really go for. In some cases, the body really does need to rest. But in a lot of cases, it's just creating one more issue unnecessarily. Something interesting may be coming up in the mind, something, however, that one member of the committee doesn't want to be revealed, and so it makes you sleepy. Or just plain old laziness comes in and you latch on to any sign in the body, any sign in the mind, that you're getting sleepy, and make that an excuse to stop. In cases like that, the best kind of food for you is good, heavy breathing, deep breathing. Whatever breathing you find energizing. It's the opposite with restlessness and anxiety. The mind has no place where it can settle down in the present moment, so it goes hunting outside for anything, whatever. When it's anxious about things, it can say, look, I have to worry about this. If I don't worry about this, I won't be prepared, I won't be protected. This is where the food of concentration on its own is often not enough. You have to supplement it with the food of discernment, which tells you that whatever is going to happen in the future, you don't really know the details of the danger ahead of you. But you do know that whatever the dangers, expected or unexpected, you're going to need a lot of discernment, you're going to need a lot of alertness, you're going to need a lot of concentration, patience, endurance, all these good qualities to see you through. And this is how you develop them, by meditating. Not by sitting here worrying. And finally, there's uncertainty. The mind can gorge itself on that. One reason might be the part of the mind that doesn't want to practice, doesn't want to give up its desires, its cravings. Another reason might be a lack of confidence in yourself. In the first case, you've got to pry around and see, why would I not want to find true happiness? After all, this is a common desire among all your committee members. How to be happy, what would make you happy? And they hold on to their ideas of what would make you happy. So you've got to point out to them the drawbacks of those ideas. Desire for wealth, desire for power, These things can bring a lot of suffering and harm in their wake. And here the Buddha is offering you a totally harmless kind of food, a totally harmless kind of pleasure. Do you really love yourself? If you do, you'd go for the harmless. You'd avoid any kind of harm. As for lack of confidence in yourself, ask yourself, can I be with this breath? Well, yes. How about this breath? Yes. In the beginning, content yourself with small victories. As the Buddha said, even just a finger snap of the desire to be skillful is, in and of itself, meritorious. Sometimes we're even afraid to want the path, because we're afraid that we'd be committed to more than we can handle, and the part of the mind that's not ready to be committed keeps pulling you back. But you can keep reminding yourself, I'm not totally committed yet. I just want to think this thought. That it would be really good to find a path that puts an end to suffering, to find a path that I am capable of following, and have some confidence in myself. Learn to feed off these small victories, so that they get larger. And turn your attention back to the breath, so that you have something even better to feed on. Keep looking for those sensitive spots inside. Try to nourish them with the breath, so that you associate the practice of concentration with a sense of real, visceral well-being. That way, the mind will be more and more inclined to want to go in this direction. It's as when you're trying to change your diet for the body. Sometimes you try to change from all the greasy, bad food that you've been enjoying to something healthy, and part of the mind resists. It likes the grease, it likes the sugar, it likes the salt. But if you learn how to fix your health food really well, then you begin to realize, I actually feel better this way, and it tastes good. So you've got to learn how to be a good cook of your breath. Show some imagination in how you deal with the breath, like that image in the canon of the wise cook who notices what his master likes. Whether it's salty or sweet or alkaline, bland, spicy. Try to figure out what your mind and body would like to enjoy right now, would like to feed off of right now. And see what you can do with the breath to provide that. A similar principle applies with the other meditation topics. If you're doing Buddho, think of the whole body as being energized by the word Buddho. As I was saying today, think of every cell in your body going Buddho together, so that it's not just a mechanical exercise. It's much more organic. You're feeding the mind, you're feeding the body. That way, you've got something good to offer when parts of the mind want to go off and have a midnight snack, gobble down some junk food. You say, look, I have something better, right here, right now. And it's not going to cause trouble tomorrow morning. I'm not going to have any diarrhea from this, any digestive illness. This is food that's good all the way. Good from your mouth all the way through your system. That way, you have another answer to that question of what is one. You have a mind that's one, with one object. And it's happy to be there. Because it finds that this is the best food there is. Remorse. August 30th, 2016. When you sit down to meditate and settle down with the breath, the mind becomes very sensitive. Sometimes things you did in the past that you don't feel right about will come up. And they hurt. At times like that, it's all too easy to start feeling remorse. Remorse is not an attitude or a feeling that the Buddha recommended. As he noticed, it weakens you. We usually feel remorse for one of two reasons. One is the childish belief that if you feel bad enough about having done something, then the punishment will be mitigated. And the other, of course, is the feeling that if you don't feel badly about something, you'll probably repeat the mistake again. In the first case, feeling bad about it is not going to make any difference. Noticing that it was a mistake and resolving not to repeat it. That's the best that can be expected of a human being. As for the fear that we've got some suffering awaiting us in the future as a kind of punishment, the Buddha recommends that, if you want not to suffer from the results of past bad actions or past unskillful actions, you develop the Brahmaviharas and particularly equanimity, along with the ability not to be overcome by pain, and not to be overcome by pleasure. Pleasure and pain go together. If you get overcome by pleasure and try to hold on to the pleasure, it can turn into pain. And it's already got you overwhelmed. It's like catching a fish. You discover that you have a huge fish on your line that can either dive way down into the ocean or jump out of the water. You see it leap up and you say, "Ah, this is pleasure," and you hold on to the line. But then it dives down to the ocean and pulls you down with it. So if the mind is overcome either by pleasure or pain, there's going to be suffering. But as for the question of whether you deserve to suffer or not, it's interesting. The Buddha never talks about people deserving to suffer. He simply says that certain actions lead to certain results. But he's here to cure our problem of suffering whether it's deserved or not. He never said, "I'll teach you the end of suffering only if you don't deserve to suffer." The end of suffering is there for everyone, whether they deserve to suffer or not. That point should be underlined many, many times. The teaching on karma is not meant to explain the horrible things that happen to people, or to justify meting out misery to them. It's supposed to be used to explain how you can find a way out so that whatever you did in the past, there's a way out for you. Think of Angulimala. He had killed scores of people, and yet he was able to become an arahant. So the question of fear over deserved suffering. The Buddha is not here to tell you that you deserve to suffer. He's here to say, this is the way you act skillfully so that you don't have to suffer. And if you've done unskillful things in the past, note the fact. Note that it was a mistake, resolve not to repeat it, and then develop the Brahmaviharas. Goodwill for yourself, goodwill for everyone. Compassion for yourself, compassion for everyone. Empathetic joy for yourself, empathetic joy for everyone. Equanimity for yourself, equanimity for everyone. Yet he also says you have to develop discernment. After all, sometimes you can do very unskillful things based on what you think is the compassionate thing to do, but you can't simply trust your loving heart to tell you what to do in a given situation, thinking that where there's a lot of love, that'll take care of it. We can do some awfully unskillful things based on love. So what is the proper motivation to make sure you don't repeat a mistake? The Buddha lists two qualities. One is heedfulness and the other is samvega. Heedfulness is simply realizing that whatever you do will come back in one way or another, and so you want to be very, very careful about what you do. Samvega is the attitude that looks at life as a whole and sees how scary it is. That's one of the meanings of the word samvega. The other meaning is dismay. You think of how we are born again and again and again. We all want happiness, but we can do some really unskillful things based on our desire for happiness. We find people whom we love and we can do unskillful things based on our love. In other words, as long as we're living under the power of delusion, then no matter how good things get, there's always a downside. There's always the possibility that everything will fall apart. No matter how much we understand about the Dhamma, there are times when we forget. Thinking in this way gives you the motivation to want to get out of the cycle. And the path of meditation is the most skillful way out. Some people say that it's selfish that you're just pulling yourself out. But think about what samsara means. Samsara is not a place. It's an activity, something we do. We keep wandering on. We get this body and we wander through life with this body. When we can't use this body anymore, the mind goes wandering off to find something else. And it's driven by craving and clinging. And you know what the mind is like when it's driven by craving and clinging. Especially when it's being pushed out of something where it's used to being. It's going to look for something new and just grab onto anything. It's like being pushed out of your house. You'll take the first house that appears on the market. So this is an activity. And we actually create our worlds of becoming through the activity of wandering on, through craving. We're creating our individual worlds to feed on. So it's like an addiction. And the best thing to do with an addiction is to learn how to end it. You'll benefit, the people around you will benefit too. Because as we feed on our worlds, we're often feeding on the same food sources that other people are because our worlds overlap, which means there's competition. So simply pulling yourself out of the cycle really helps to at least take one mouth out of the feeding cycle. And you're setting a good example. Because the things we do in order to get out are not just a matter of running away. We have to be generous. We have to be virtuous. We try to develop good qualities. One of the motivations for doing this is compassion. As the Buddha said, the people who help us with our practice, if we really do get out, then they benefit greatly. So it's important to realize that no matter how good things get, no matter how much you've learned about things, if you haven't reached any of the noble attainments, there's always a possibility of backsliding. That's what's scary, that's what's terrifying about all this. This means that the proper response when you've realized that you've made a mistake, you've harmed somebody, is not remorse. It's heedfulness together with samvega. And it's interesting that, in the Buddha's analysis for both of our reasons for wanting to go for remorse, his antidotes for remorse in both cases are the brahmaviharas, attitudes of limitless goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. But he also requires discernment because, as I said, compassion can sometimes be diluted. That's where compassion gets scary. This is why discernment is so important. What does it come down to? An understanding of the principles of what's skillful and what's not. The Buddha gives some basic examples in the precepts. But then there are the subtler things, and those require a lot of discernment, a lot of mindfulness, a lot of alertness to see how the mind can lie to itself about what's skillful and what's not, and to learn how to see through those lies. This is why we meditate. To strengthen our powers of mindfulness, to strengthen our powers of alertness, so that we can see what we're doing and what's actually coming about as the result of our actions. And then remembering that, again, you don't have to use remorse in order to pound it into the mind that something was a mistake. Heedfulness and samvega are enough. So basically what the Buddha is doing is having us react to our mistakes as adults. One of the things you've learned as an adult is that mistakes are very easy to make, but you can learn from them. And that's the important thing. Learning from them while being mature enough to know how not to repeat the mistake, without having to beat yourself up over your past mistakes. At the same time, you prepare yourself. You know that you've got some past mistakes. There's going to be some pain coming in the future. This shouldn't be news. So you develop the qualities of mind that can guarantee that pain and pleasure won't overcome the mind. In other words, you develop concentration, you develop discernment. Having concentration as an alternative to sensual pain and pleasure puts you in a safe place, so that when pains come, you have an alternative place to go. That way, the pains don't have to drive you around. And as you've learned in getting the mind to settle down, if, when you're working with the breath, there's a sense of ease, then if you leave the breath for the sense of ease, everything falls apart, blurs out. You get into what's called delusion concentration, where things are very nice and very still, but you don't really know where you are. When you come out, you're not really sure whether you were asleep or awake. That's not the path. So you have to learn that even though there's pleasure coming up as you're working with the breath, you can still stay with the breath, you don't get waylaid by the pleasure. In this way, getting the mind properly into concentration helps you overcome your attachment to sensual pleasures, and also helps you not to be overwhelmed by the sense of pleasure that comes from getting the mind to settle down and be still. Now this, of course, includes discernment, because that ultimately is what's going to free you from pleasure and pain. And notice, the Buddha's discernment works whether the pleasures or pains are deserved or not. You realize that you've had enough of that back and forth. You want to go to something better. And so you can pull the mind out of both pleasure and pain. You see the mind, or awareness, as something separate from pleasure and pain. This is one of the skills you develop as you meditate. And this is a really important skill. Because as that chant said just now, we're all subject to aging, illness, and death. We have these things lying in wait and we want to be ready for them. As someone once said, the most amazing thing about human beings is that we all know we're going to die, but we all act as if we didn't. Well, you know. Act as if you take it to heart. You can prepare. You can get the mind ready for times when there'll be aging, illness, and death. And yet you don't have to suffer from them because you've learned how to separate the concern for pleasure and pain, and the pleasure and pains themselves, from your awareness. You let these aspects of the present separate themselves into three separate things. That way, the pleasures and pains, and your concerns about pleasures and pains, don't have to weigh the mind down. They're there, but they're not having an impact on the mind. That's when you're really safe. You get to that safe place not through remorse, but through heedfulness and a sense of samvega. Those are two emotions that you can really rely on. Of course, you don't want to just sit in samvega. You want it to propel you to act. As with that chant just now on aging, illness, death, separation. That part is all about samvega. But the reflection on kama, that's actually pasada, confidence that there's a way out. It's through your actions that you can find the way out. Always keep that in mind. Things don't end with samvega. They move on to pasada, confidence, and from there on to release. So meditate with confidence. Think of your past mistakes with confidence that you're not going to have to repeat them. Because you're the type of person who learns. Wake up from addiction. January 12, 2016. As you're settling down with the breath, you don't want to think too much about it, just enough to make it comfortable. You don't want to analyze things to the point where you start losing the breath and getting caught up in the analysis. So you ask yourself just a few simple questions. Where do you feel the breath right now? Does it feel comfortable? What would make it feel more comfortable? What would make it feel more like something you'd really want to settle down and spend some time with? That's pretty much it. As I've said before, when you're getting the mind into concentration and developing jhana, the object isn't jhana. The object is the breath. It's only when you've settled down with the breath for quite a while that you begin to be in a position where you can step back a little bit to really question and understand what you're doing, so that it does become more of a skill. You begin to see patterns. And one of the patterns you begin to notice is that you really are developing what the Buddha called the 7 factors for awakening. Sometimes the list is mistaken to be a description of what awakening is like, but it's not. It's a description of how you get there. Awakening is so much more than these things. And of course, the description of how you get there is much more useful than the description of what it's going to be like when you get there anyhow. So what have you got on the list? You've got mindfulness. In this case, remembering to keep your focus on the breath, which is an aspect of the body in and of itself. You're ardently trying to stay here, alert to what's going on. Mindfulness means remembering not only to stay here, but also what works in order to keep you here. Then you're ardent to do whatever needs to be done. And finally, as they say in the texts, you're putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. In other words, you're with the body in and of itself, and not the body in the context of the world or thinking about issues of the world. You're right here with this sensation of the presence of the body. That's your frame of reference. Then there's analysis of qualities, as you analyze what kind of breathing is good, what kind of breathing is not good. You also look into the qualities in the mind. Is the pressure of the mind's focus too strong or too weak? Are you feeling lax and lazy, or are you feeling overly stimulated? And what can you do to bring things back into balance? Once you've analyzed things, then you put in the effort to bring them into balance. That effort is the 3rd factor for awakening. When you do it right, there's going to be a sense of fullness, refreshment, or rapture. That's the 4th. This rapture or refreshment can come in a weak form or in a strong form. But the refreshment is what allows you to stay here and say, oh, yes, this really is good. Then, after a while, the rapture or refreshment has done its work and begins to fade a little bit, and there's more of a sense of ease and calm, and when there's a calm, then the mind can get concentrated. Those are the 5th and 6th factors. And as the mind goes through the stages of concentration, you finally get to a point where the mind feels very equanimous. It's not excited about anything, but it feels okay right here, and okay not in a small way. Okay in a big way. Everything feels very stable, on an even keel. You feel really at home, settle down here. That equanimity is the 7th and final factor. Now, analyzing things in terms of these 7 factors is useful for reminding you how to get into concentration when things are difficult. And it's important to notice that this is one of the lists of qualities in which your discernment does some work before you settle in. In other words, you're not just using brute force to get the mind to settle down, and it's not the case that it naturally settles down on its own. You find that you've got to do a little work to analyze things enough to see what's good and what's not good, what needs encouraging, what needs cutting away. And only then will the mind settle down. But understanding your practice in terms of these factors is good not only for reminding yourself how to get into concentration, but for other purposes as well. One way in which they're really useful is if you find yourself engaged in some addictive behavior or addictive thinking. You can think of that addiction as like being caught in a bad dream, trapped in the sense that it keeps looping around. The mind goes through lots of different feedback loops. If you were to trace the mind as it wanders through the day ordinarily, it tends to switch from one loop to another loop to another one to another one. But certain patterns of behavior are more like getting stuck in a loop and not being able to get out. You do something to feel better, but then you feel bad about it, and then because you feel bad about it, you want to do something to make yourself feel good, and so you go back and do the first thing again, because you think that's the only way you're going to get a little hit of pleasure. The mind just goes around and around and around in this loop and doesn't come out. You've got to learn how to get out of that loop. And as I said, if you can regard it as a bad dream, ask yourself, what do you do to get out of the dream? Well, you wake up. That's what these factors are for. So let's say you've got a desire to give in to some lustful thinking. Part of the mind says there's going to be some pleasure there, but you have to remember and recognize that that's not a part of the mind you want to hang out with or to believe. Even though there might be some pleasure in the short term, the long-term results are not all that positive, not at all in your best interests. So the first thing you do is establish your awareness with the body or with any of the frames of reference for mindfulness. But say you're with the body. Okay, work with the breath. Try to reclaim the breath, because oftentimes these patterns of thinking tend to take hold of your breath. They come in and seize it and make it theirs. They appropriate the breath for their purposes. They make you feel uncomfortable here, uncomfortable there. This part of the body feels tense, that part of the body feels blocked. And part of the committee will say, okay, if you give in to our desire, then we'll unblock things. It's as if they've kidnapped the breath and are holding it hostage. So you've got to reclaim the breath. Breathe deeply. Breathe in a way that feels refreshing, that airs things out inside, and that allows you to establish yourself with a frame of reference, so that you're not swimming around with these thoughts. You've at least got the breath in the body here. When you hold on to that, you're putting yourself in a position where you can watch things in the mind and analyze them from a little bit of distance. You don't have to get involved. Remember, the main prerequisite for understanding things going on in the mind is your ability to step back from them and see them as something separate. That's what the image of the committee of the mind is useful for. As is Ajahn Lee's image of all those germs going through your blood, some of them going through the blood vessels around your brain, and dropping off a few thoughts as they go past, or going around other parts of the body, and making you feel feelings here and feelings there. Sensations here and there that would get you provoked into doing something unskillful. The purpose of these perceptions is to help you see your thoughts as alien. You don't have to side with them, you don't have to take them on. And as for the committee, just remember that some of the members of the committee are bad. They've been pretty powerful in the past, but they don't have to maintain that power. You can learn how to change the balance of power in the mind. So see them as alien, too. That deprives them of a lot of their strength right there. Once you've got this beachhead with the breath and this position where you can stand at the body in and of itself, then you can analyze things further. In other words, this urge you have to think these thoughts. What does it feel like in the body? What are the sensations accompanying it in the different parts of the body? What are the feelings? What are the thoughts that go through the mind? Instead of just running with them, tell yourself that you're going to watch them for a bit to see what they're like, where they're heading, and then take them apart. The Buddha gives lots of different ways of analyzing these things. You could look at them as aggregates. Sensations in the body, feelings of pleasure or pain, perceptions, i.e., the images you hold in mind. Take perceptions, for example. What are the images you hold in mind? Not so much about the object you're lusting for, but about lust itself. Why does it seem attractive? What's the glamour? What's the appeal? Can you switch those images? Or look at the way you talk to yourself about it. Can you change the storyline of your fantasy so that it ends up pretty disastrous? Therapists call this poisoning the fantasy. Analyze things like this so that you can step back from them and see them as separate, and see exactly what it is that exerts the pull that keeps you going back again and again and again. So you take the terms of analysis and you keep applying them. This is what the factor of persistence is. If you see something that's unskillful, take it apart. Don't simply fall in with it. Step back from it. And the more you can analyze it into discrete sensations, discrete feelings, or discrete thoughts, the less power it has. It's because these things connect up that they create a strong impression, an overwhelming urge to think thoughts that you know are not going to be helpful, or to do things you know are going to be unskillful, that are going to lead to trouble down the line. Try to open things up. All too often, when you get focused on something like this, be it anger, lust or whatever, your awareness narrows down and seems to be surrounded on all sides. But if you can open up your awareness, give it a foundation here in the body, and then take all these different things apart, then you see that as they're taken on one by one, they don't have so much power. They're not so formidable. It's when they meld together that they seem strong and overwhelming. So take them apart. Chop them into pieces. As you keep at this in the beginning, it's going to be a strain because you've got to work against some very strong tendencies. But there will come a point where you break through and there's a sense of refreshment. You've made it to the other side. That's what allows the mind to finally get a sense of ease, to be concentrated, and to develop a sense of equanimity toward the original urge. In other words, not be interested in it anymore. This is how you wake up from the addiction. When you've done this once, then you want to remember that it felt really good when you finally got past the lust. That's a good thing to keep in mind, as food for mindfulness the next time around. As we're practicing, we're trying to gather up enough experience so that our mindfulness isn't informed just by what we've heard or read. It's also informed by what we've done that's gotten results. And you want to remind yourself of how good the results are, because that's going to change the tenor of the perceptions in your mind, especially the ones that tell you that once this urge comes, you've got to give in to it inevitably, and there's no other way out once you've already gotten this far down the line with this particular fantasy, so let's just run with it. You've got to learn how to say, no. Maybe I've been with it for a certain amount of time, but I don't have to follow it all the way through. I don't have to finish the storyline. I'm not committed. I've cut things off in the past, so why can't I do it now? It's interesting that all too often we find it hard to be committed to meditation, but when something unskillful comes into the mind, we think, well, I've already done this much, I've gotten this far. I'm committed, so I might as well go all the way. We can cut that storyline, or that false sense of obligation. Then there's the other voice, the one that says, you've given in the past, you're sure to give in again in 5 minutes, so make it easy on both of us. Give in right now and get it over with. Don't struggle. Well, remind yourself that that doesn't get it over with, and that the struggle itself is something skillful. Ajahn Mahabua talks about this a lot. He says, when you give in totally without a struggle, how can you say that you lost? You didn't even put up a fight. If there were a fight, then you could say one side won and the other side lost, but there's no fight at all. There's more honor in struggling and losing than in not struggling at all. So put up some struggle. And when the voice says that you're going to give in, you can reply, well, I don't know what I'm going to do in 5 minutes' time, but right now I'm not going to give in. And of course, in 5 minutes' time you tell yourself again, Right now I'm not going to give in, either. That way, you can make your determination outlast the urge to give in to your addiction. And you can strengthen that determination by being with the breath, by having these tools for analyzing things, so that what seems like an overwhelming urge is broken down simply into aggregates, little bits and pieces of physical sensations, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness of these things. That's how you get past. That's how you wake up out of these bad dreams. So try to appreciate the fact that as you're working on getting the mind settled down with the breath, you're getting to know your mind a lot better. You're developing some skills that you can use in a lot of different situations that you might not expect, but the skills are there, ready to be put into use. The Buddha taught things that are useful. Sometimes his lists seem dry and foreign, but as you get more and more acquainted with your breath, acquainted with the mind as it circles around the breath and finally settles in, you see that the Buddha's descriptions are really accurate, very precise, very helpful. He worked many eons to be in the position where he could give that kind of advice, and he meant for it to be used. So think of all the trouble he went to learn these things and to pass them on. Make it a sign of your gratitude for the Buddha that you're going to use his teachings and come out with results. Mindfulness 2.0. August 19, 2016. Ajahn Suwa tells the story of when he was a young monk and first went to stay with Ajahn Mun. One day, Ajahn Mun asked him how his meditation was going, and Ajahn Suwa replied, "My mind is all over the place. It's distracted." Ajahn Mun comforted him, saying, "Well, the fact that you know that the mind is distracted counts as mindfulness." And Ajahn Suwa took it well. He realized that Ajahn Mun was trying to comfort him, not saying that what he was doing was good. It's a beginning step, recognizing that your mind is distracted. But once you've recognized it, you've got to do something about it. You've got to figure out how to make it undistracted. This is very different from how mindfulness is usually taught nowadays, where it's all about being non-reactive, just being with whatever comes up. That's not how the Buddha taught mindfulness. Now, there is some virtue in being with whatever comes up, because all too often we try to deny things. Years back, when they had that Ajahn Chah celebration up in Portola Valley, a lot of his students were talking about what attracted them to Ajahn Chah. And it seems that in every case, they were having trouble simply adjusting to the fact that they were in Thailand, accepting things the way they were. So a lot of his teaching had to do with equanimity and patience. He probably saw that Westerners lacked these qualities and that they needed them to be reinforced before they could really get started on anything further in the practice. Our society is in sore need of equanimity and patience, which is why a lot of what gets sold as mindfulness nowadays is actually about being equanimous with regard to whatever comes up, being patient with whatever comes up. But that's not the end of the story. There was an incident way back in Burma. I've forgotten which of the Burmese meditation traditions they tell it in, but one of the founders of the tradition went to see an old monk up in the hills and asked him about where to look for good guidance in meditation. And the old monk told him, "Everything you need to know is in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, isn't it?" Which was a huge piece of misinformation. The Mahasatipatthana Sutta tells only a part of mindfulness practice. Unfortunately, though, the founder of the tradition went back and took that as his guide. The full formula at the beginning of the sutta says, you keep track of the body in and of itself, feelings in and of themselves, the mind in and of itself, mental qualities in and of themselves. Ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. But then the rest of the sutta talks about only one part of that formula. What it means to keep track of body, or feelings, or mind, or mental qualities in and of themselves. So the sutta is basically teaching mindfulness 1.0. It tells you one part of the formula. What it means to keep track of something. But as for the rest, being ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world, that gets left for other parts of the canon. And yet the parts that are left out are what the practice is all about. Ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. This is how you get the mind into concentration. Alert means that you watch what you're doing and the results that come from what you're doing. Mindful means that you keep in mind what you've got to do. And ardency is the desire to do it well. Ajahn Lee, when he explains mindfulness practice, points to the wisdom in ardency. You don't just know about things. You know that something has to be done with them. And this is hinted at even in the sutta. When it talks about dealing with the hindrances, dealing with the factors for awakening, dealing with the fetters that arise at the six senses, it doesn't tell you just to watch them coming and going. Say that a hindrance or a fetter arises. You watch for when it's present, you watch for when it's not, and then you watch to see how it may be made to go away and not come back. With each of the factors for awakening, you watch for when it's present, you watch for when it's not, and then you watch to see how it can be maintained and developed to a point of culmination. So even in the sutta, it's not just a matter of sitting there watching things. There's a direction where you want to go. There's a direction for your ardency. That's Mindfulness 2.0. It takes you through the ardency into concentration. As the Buddha said, one of the functions of mindfulness is to keep unskillful qualities out of the mind and bring skillful qualities in. Like a gatekeeper at a frontier fortress. You've got to watch out for the spies and the other people who might create trouble in your fortress, so you learn to recognize them in order to keep them from coming in. And you remember to recognize the people who are friends and allies, the soldiers and other people on your side, so that you can let them in. So, as you're sitting here meditating, you do have to admit what's coming up, but don't just stop with the admitting. You realize that something has to be done. What you keep in mind are the duties of the Four Noble Truths. Stress has to be comprehended, its cause has to be abandoned, its cessation has to be realized, and a path to its cessation has to be developed. In many cases, the Buddha emphasizes two of those duties more than the others: the abandoning and the developing. And so here we are, trying to develop concentration, which means that anything that comes up that's not related to the breath, you put it aside, put it aside. Anything that is related to the breath that helps you settle down, you try to develop it, you try to strengthen it. This is what it means to be ardent. And this is why it's wise, because without the ardency, things come and things go, and you're just sitting there on the side of the road watching them come and go. But here, this is your mind. It's not just cars on a road. And what shape is your mind in? What shape do you want it to be in? You want your mind to be in good shape. You want to be able to say no to the things in the mind that are going to harm it, and yes to the things that will help it develop. You don't want to just watch the cars. You want to be in the driver's seat, headed in the right direction. So anything related to the breath, anything that helps you settle down with the breath. Yes. And once you're here, what do you do with the breath? Ardency in this case means being especially sensitive to the breath and to what kind of breathing would feel really good right now. After all, the purpose of right mindfulness is to lead into right concentration. So if you can get absorbed in the breath, gain an interest in the breath, feel at ease with the breath, that helps you stay with a sense of well-being. The Buddha lists 4 qualities that help with success in doing this, the 4 bases of power. The first is simply the desire. You want to do this well. That's the ardency. But ardency also contains 2 other bases of power: persistence and a quality called intent. This is where right effort and the 4 bases of success overlap. You learn how to generate the desire to do this well. Then you stick with it, you keep at it. If the mind wanders off, you bring it back. It wanders off again, you bring it back again. 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, 100 times. Keep bringing it back. Show it that you mean business. When it comes back, pay careful attention to 2 things. 1. What would be a really comfortable breath to stay with, so that the mind will want to stay here? And 2. Watch out for the fact that it's going to wander off again. You want to be able to catch it before it goes. The more quickly you can catch it, the more you'll see into the mind, the various stages and how it slips off, and somehow tries to deny to itself what it's doing. But when you can see through that, then you're in a much better position to stop it from happening. And finally there's the fourth base of power, the mamsa, which is another aspect of discernment. You try to use your ingenuity in figuring out ways that'll help the mind to stay. This is what gets you absorbed, because you're experimenting and you're learning. You're not just tying the mind down to a stake, you're gaining some training in what is it like to be with the body? And what's actually going on in the body? What are the layers of breath energy in the body? We talk about the in and out breath and the breath that gets effused through the nerves in the blood vessels. Well, there's another level that's even deeper still, that's very quiet. It's a kind of energy, but it's an energy that just stays in place. You can access it only when the mind is very quiet, too. Different people will find that they have nodes of this energy in different places. It could be in the middle of the chest, it could be down by the breastbone, or right between the eyes. There are lots of different places where if you're really, really quiet you can get the sense of great stillness right there. And there's no need for an in and out breath right there. If you can access that, try to stay with it. It's a good resting place for the mind. But know that it's good to be with all the different levels of the breath. Because sometimes the problem is not there with the still breath, it's with the breath energy spreading through the body. It might not be spreading well, so what can you do to get it to go to places where it ordinarily doesn't go? Try breathing in different directions. In from the left, in from the right, in from the front, in from the back, down, up. See what helps for that particular spot. Or sometimes the problem is simply the fact that the breath is too shallow or too deep. Watch out for the breath when it gets really shallow and very light. If your range of awareness isn't broad, you'll tend to drift off. Sometimes after a day of work, you need some heavier breathing to refresh the body. Learn to realize that these three different types of breath energy, the in and out breath, the suffused breath, and the still breath, have their uses. Then, as you're maintaining your mind in the present moment, this is a good area to study, to apply your ingenuity to figure out what's going on and what could make it better. This makes the concentration more interesting. At the same time, it gets the mind more and more under your control. As the Buddha said, one of the purposes of meditation is to think thoughts that you want to think, and not think thoughts you don't want to think. That, too, is one of the purposes of mindfulness. He calls mindfulness a governing principle. In other words, it watches over what's unskillful and figures out how to put an end to it. It watches over what's skillful and figures out how to develop it. When the Buddha talks about how right mindfulness, right effort, and right view all circle around all the different factors of the path, he shows clearly that the role of mindfulness is to remember. If you encounter something that's wrong, you have to remember to abandon it. If you encounter something that's skillful, you remember to develop it. That's Mindfulness 2.0. After learning how to watch things arise and pass away on their own, you now learn how to make good things arise and make unskillful things pass away. And that way, the mindfulness gives a lot more benefits. It gives you tools to deal with things so that you can actually complete the duties of the Four Noble Truths and realize the cessation of suffering. That's a large goal, but it's within our reach, something we can all do if we establish our mindfulness properly. As the Buddha said, if it were impossible to abandon unskillful qualities and to develop skillful qualities, he wouldn't have taught it. Or if the process of abandoning unskillful qualities and developing skillful qualities led to pain and suffering, he wouldn't have taught it either. But because we are able to abandon these unskillful things and develop the skillful ones, and it's a good thing to do because it leads to true happiness. That's why the Buddha taught, and that's why we're practicing. In alignment with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the tremendous significance of sharing wisdom widely. At present, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into a user-friendly audio format. The responsibility to advance this noble endeavor now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's continue the age-old tradition of knowledge dissemination and the nurturing of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this undertaking, and together, we can effect profound and positive changes in the lives of many.